This is Diana Sullivan in Austin, Texas. Here is a beautiful, feminine ear warmer that you can make very quickly. It takes very little yarn, less than 2 ounces. So if you have some little bits of beautiful novelty yarn, here's a great choice to use that yarn. I have some lightweight and very pretty mohair blend. Let's get started. My machine is a 9mm Brother Bulky electronic, model 270. This is the pattern that I programmed in. Black, white, that's rows 1 and 2. White, black, that's rows 3 and 4. If you have a punch card machine, you can certainly do this pattern. Here is what we call the bird's eye card. You can see it's every other needle is going to be selected, and then the following row, the alternate needles. If you use this card, put it on the double length setting, and then you'll get exactly the pattern I just showed you. Or, do you have a card like this that is already punched with 2 rows that are like that, and then the 2 offset rows? If you have a card like that, that will work as well. So this is a really easy one to do. My needle arrangement is from number 11, left of 0, to number 10, right of 0, and I'm using every other needle for a fast cast on that I will do with waste yarn. So 1 row with every other needle, followed by a row with all the needles. Instead of bothering with a comb, I'm going to use a brass weight, but you could certainly use a comb for this cast on. My waste yarn is a color that contrasts with my pink mohair. It's kind of a lavender smooth yarn, and my tension is tension 4. I go across that first row with the lavender yarn, put a clip on it that'll help this end stitch to knit off, and then I hang this brass weight on instead of a comb. Alternatively, you could use a comb. Then I'm going to take my needle pusher and bring out the in-between needles. I'll knit a few rows with the waste yarn. Then I'll pull a loop down on one end and knit the final row. The final row will act like a ravel cord. I'll be able to remove it when I finish knitting my headband. So I have put a clothespin on that side. I'm cutting this yarn over here, and I'm going to put a clothespin there. That will help that to knit off. Now it's time to put my row counter on 0, 0, 0 and begin with the yarn for the headband. My row counter's on 0, 0, 0. I'm threading the machine, still on tension 4, with the pink, and I'm going to knit 1 row plain. Now I need to start patterning. To begin patterning, I will take the carriage outside the turn mark, and there's a dial here on the side of the carriage. I will turn it to KC. KC will begin to select needles. Then I am going to go to the control panel for the machine and press the start key. That way it starts on the first line of the pattern. Now when I knit that first row, it will select every other needle, plus it will select the end needles. So the end needles need to be selected every time because we're going to use tuck stitch, and we do not want to tuck an end needle. That tends to cause a dropped stitch. Now, I put a clothespin on this loose end. I'm going to take a quick look at the carriage and just show you that. I need to push in both tuck buttons because we're going to tuck in both directions. And now, for the easy, boring part. I'm going to knit 160 rows. When I go to the left, you can see that it is laying the yarn in these but not knitting it off. And then when I go to the right, You can see the yarn laying on there. And I just keep going for 160 rows. Now I'll save you some time. I'll be back. I finished 160 rows, and now I want to turn off patterning. If you take this wheel and rotate it this time back to in, not only does it stop selecting needles, but the tuck buttons pop out. The other way to get the buttons to pop out is to push this little lever. And now I want to do 2 rows without patterning. I am not going to cut the yarn at this time. Instead, I'm going to take the yarn out of the carriage and park it under the end of the machine. I'm going to use this yarn a little bit later, but it'll sit here and not give me any problems. I have to take the work off and rehang it. I'm going to do that by knitting a few rows with that lavender scrap yarn. If I cut that yarn and go across, the knitting will drop. But before I do that, I'll get all of the hardware off of the knitting. I go across and drop the knitting. And now let's stop for a moment and take a look at it. This pattern can be done with either side for the right side. This is the purl side of the work, and this is the knit side of the work. I'm going to use the knit side of the work as the outside. So I'm going to rehang this work with the outside toward me. I'll just roll this down and I'll be able to do that. I will rehang on only 10 needles. I'll use the 10 needles in the middle of the bed, and I will start from the right side of this piece of work and pick up 1 stitch at a time onto each needle. That's only going to hang half of the work, but this will be folded. The way this is folded and bound off is what gives us the rather interesting knotted look to the front of the headband. A lot of people do these by sewing, but I really like this no-sew method. It looks so good. Okay, so I've hung those. Now you'll recall there were 21 stitches. So I'm going to hang 1 more stitch on this leftmost needle. That'll leave me with 10 remaining stitches on this end of the work. Now I pick up the bottom of the work. The wrong side's facing me, but I'm going to turn it so the right side's facing me. And I'm going to take the leftmost 10 stitches right here by the waist yarn and put that on these 10 needles. So 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see the stitches peeking in between the waist yarn. My yarn is thin and they're not the easiest to see, but they're easy to see in person anyway. So I've got those on. Now what I'm going to do is take this end, I'm going to fold it around and hang this on those stitches. You end up with 4 layers of work hung on those 10 stitches. As you can see, when I get these hung, I'm going to end up with the loose end of the yarn coming from the right-hand side. That means I'll have to get the carriage over to the other side so I can thread it up and knit it. But I'm not finished hanging things. I still need to get this group on. So starting here, I'll pick up 1 stitch for each needle. I'm careful not to miss a stitch because after all, when it's all finished, If I don't pick up one of the stitches and I remove the waste yarn, that stitch will unravel. If you have an extra stitch, just double it up. Now I need to get to the other side with my carriage so that I can knit these, and it's pretty fat, so what I'm going to do is squish it in, bring the needles out to hold. I am changing the setting on my carriage, and I'll show you as I bring it across so that it doesn't disturb the work. You see this lever right here? I moved it over to the H. Now I'm going to move it back because I need to knit my last row. I'm going to do a loop through a loop bind off, but I haven't been doing it as loosely as I usually do. I actually like this to gather up a little. So I'm only going to bring it up by 2 numbers, from tension 4 to tension 6, and then I'm giving this a good hard push back against the bed so that the machine can clear it, and I'm going to knit those off. It will knit them this time because I put the setting back, so that gives me, I have a loop. I don't like the loop. I'm going to get rid of it. Now, one way to do that is to just pull it through like this. I wouldn't do this except that it's the very last row, and I'm going to latch it off. There we go. You probably won't have that loop. That's the first time that's happened to me, but it shows you what you could do if something like that were to occur. You could also rip back and knit across again. So here I am ready to bind off. I will bring these needles into hold position, and I will I've got my latch tool. This is just my typical loop through a loop bind off, where I put my tool inside this first loop, pull it off the needle, put it in the second loop, push it in far enough so that that first loop is below the latch and the second loop is in the latch, then pull the second through the first, and then repeat with the third. This loop down here is below the latch and this one's in it, which means when I pull one loop through the other and I very quickly bind off. It's only 10 stitches, so this goes fast. And then, having done that, I still have the loose end. I'm going to pull it through with the latch tool and then tighten it up. Now, there's a lot of waste yarn here. So let's flip it around and get that waste yarn removed. The row that was at the end, that one will just unravel. So that's certainly an easy thing to get off. If it catches, you may have split the yarn and then you may have to take a little snip on the waste yarn only, and then you can deal with that. Now on this other one, it doesn't come off quite as easily. To get it off, go down and find this loop. I had a long loop down here. This was at the last row of the waste yarn because this was the bottom of the knitting. I knitted a few rows and then I had this loop. I get the part of the loop that is closest to the pink, and I pull on that. Pull, pull, pull. And eventually it pulls out and the waste yarn comes right off. Once I get the waste yarn out, I have 2 ends to hide on the inside. But let me turn this right side out so you can see how this turned out. Here is the finished ear warmer. I can do one of these in a little over 15 minutes, and it only takes a tiny amount of yarn, between 1 and 2 ounces. So I think you'll have a great time with this pattern.